When Alexander III of Macedon, known to history as Alexander the Great, died in Babylon in 323 BCE at the age of just 32, his empire stretched further than any other in history had before him. From the mountains of Greece to the sands of Egypt, from the plains of Persia to the edges of India, his armies had marched, fought, and conquered. Yet the world he left behind was not a stable one. Alexander had left no clear heir. His sudden death threw the vast dominion he had assembled into chaos, and the empire was torn apart almost as quickly as it had been created. In the bloody struggles that followed, his generals, known as the Diadochi, the successors, each seized pieces of Alexander's empire for themselves. Ptolemy took control of Egypt, establishing a dynasty that would last for nearly 3 centuries. Seleucus carved out an immense domain across Asia, from Syria to Mesopotamia and Persia. Antigonus and his descendants fought for control of Macedon and Greece itself. These new monarchies, known collectively as the Hellenistic kingdoms, would dominate the eastern Mediterranean for the next 150 years. Yet, despite their glittering courts, wealth, and cultural achievements, these kingdoms were fragile. They were built not on unity but on rivalry. Each successor dynasty was constantly at war with the others, each driven by ambition and the memory of Alexander's greatness. While Alexander's empire had once embodied the dream of a world united under one rule, the reality after his death was fragmentation and competition. For Greece itself, the death of Alexander marked the beginning of a long decline. The great city-states that had once defined the classical world, Athens, Sparta, Thebes, and Corinth, were shadows of their former selves. Their golden ages had passed centuries earlier. Athens, the birthplace of democracy and philosophy, had lost its empire and its independence. Sparta, once the terror of the Peloponnesian War, was a hollowed-out remnant. Thebes had been destroyed by Alexander himself, its people scattered and enslaved. The Greek mainland had become a prize contested by larger powers, its destiny shaped not by its own people, but by the dynasties of the Hellenistic monarchs. This was the world into which Rome first cast its gaze, a world of fractured states, proud traditions, and endless wars. A world that seemed far from the Italian peninsula, and yet one that would, in time, be drawn into Rome's orbit. But before Rome, there was still Macedon. The Antigonid dynasty ruled from Pella, wielding the legacy of Philip II and Alexander as their claim to dominance. The Macedonian army still fought in the phalanx formation that had conquered the Persian Empire, a wall of spears that, when unbroken, was nearly invincible. In the early Hellenistic age, Macedon remained the leading power of Greece, enforcing its authority on the fractured city-states through garrisons and alliances. At the same time, the Seleucid Empire to the east sought to expand westward, while the Ptolemies of Egypt struggled to maintain their influence in the Aegean. For the smaller states of Greece, the Aetolian League, the Achaean League, and independent polis like Athens, the choice was often one of submission to a greater power. Some sought protection under Macedon, others leaned toward Egypt, and still others tried to navigate a precarious independence. This constant shifting of alliances meant that no single Greek power could dominate for long. Greek politics became a game of survival, not glory. In the words of the historian Polybius, who would later write about Rome's rise, Greece was torn by ceaseless wars and revolutions. It was in this fractured landscape that Rome eventually found its opportunity. For centuries, the Greek world had looked east for threats and rivals. Persia had been the great enemy. Alexander had marched against the east. But few Greeks had ever thought to look west, across the Adriatic Sea, toward the Italian peninsula. To them, Italy was a land of barbarian, rugged tribes and rustic peoples, far from the sophistication of Greek culture. Yet in the 3rd century BCE, a new power was rising there. The Roman Republic, forged through centuries of conflict on the Italian mainland, had begun to expand beyond its immediate neighbors. Rome's armies, disciplined and adaptable, had defeated the Etruscans, humbled the Samnites, and broken the power of the Latin cities. By the end of the 4th century BCE, Rome was already the preeminent force in Italy, and its gaze, inevitably, would soon turn outward. But at this stage, Rome was still little known to the Greeks. The cities of southern Italy, Magna Graecia, as they were called, maintained cultural ties with the Greek world. Yet the idea that a people from Italy could one day dominate Greece itself would have seemed almost absurd. Greece, after all, was the land of Homer and Pericles, of Plato and Aristotle, of Alexander. Rome was, at best, a curiosity. And yet the fate of Greece would not be determined by its great thinkers or its glorious past. It would be determined by the reality of its fractured politics, its declining independence, and its vulnerability to outside powers. The death of Alexander had opened a wound in the Greek world, one that never healed. The Hellenistic kingdoms, though magnificent in their own way, were built on unstable foundations. They consumed their own strength in endless rivalry, while the old city-states clung desperately to the memory of their past greatness. Into this world, Rome would eventually come not as a liberator, though it often claimed that title, but as a conqueror. And as events unfolded, the Greeks would discover that their greatest threat did not come from the east, but from across the Adriatic, from a republic whose legions were destined to march far beyond Italy. The world was in transition, and in that transition, the destiny of Greece would be rewritten. When Alexander the Great exhaled his final breath in Babylon in 323 BC, he left behind more than a shattered empire. He left behind a world without direction. His armies, who had followed him to the edges of India, returned home not to a unified Greece, but to a new and chaotic order. Alexander had forged one of history's greatest empires, but he had built it around himself. With his sudden death at the age of 32, that empire collapsed like a tent whose central pole had been kicked away. The generals who had marched at his side, his companions in conquest, now turned on one another. The so-called Diadochi, the successors, carved up Alexander's world with ambition and steel. From their rivalries emerged the Hellenistic kingdoms, the Seleucid Empire stretching from Syria to Persia, the Ptolemies ruling from the wealth of Alexandria in Egypt, and the Antigonids holding sway in Macedon, the homeland of Alexander himself. On paper, Greece belonged to Macedon. In reality, Greece was now a pawn on a much larger board. The old city-states of Athens, Sparta, and Thebes were shadows of their former selves. Once, they had shaped the course of the Mediterranean. Once, they had produced philosophers, generals, and statesmen who defined an age. But by the 3rd century BCE, these cities were tired. Their independence had been eroded by Macedonian garrisons and foreign kings. Their politics had become parochial, focused more on internal feuds than on any grand vision of unity. They were living on the fading memory of their glory, and that memory was no shield against the new powers that now surrounded them. It was in this environment that the Hellenistic kingdoms dazzled the world with wealth and splendor. The city of Alexandria, with its library and lighthouse, became the beating heart of intellectual life. Pergamon grew rich from trade, its Acropolis crowned with temples. Greek art, philosophy, and science spread to lands Alexander had conquered, fusing with local traditions in a flowering of culture that historians call the Hellenistic Age. To a visitor, Greece and its cultural airs seemed vibrant, overflowing with vitality. But beneath the marble and the scholarship lay fragility. These kingdoms were unstable, built on the precarious authority of dynasties constantly at war with one another. The Seleucids clashed with the Ptolemies over Syria. Pergamon sparred with its neighbors. Even Macedon, which had once dominated all of Greece under Philip II and Alexander, found itself squeezed between enemies and weakened by internal strife. These wars consumed men, treasure, and legitimacy. Populations were drained by constant levies, and economies bled dry by tribute and taxation. And so, while Greek culture spread farther than ever before, Greek freedom was eroding at its core. The proud independence that had once driven the Persian Wars, the confidence that had built Athens' empire and Sparta's hegemony, was replaced by dependence on kings. The very idea of the polis, the self-governing city-state, was dying. The irony is that Greece's brilliance in this age masked its vulnerability. To the outside observer, Greek art, Greek ideas, and Greek cities dominated the imagination of the Mediterranean. Yet politically, Greece was fractured, weakened, and ripe for manipulation. This contradiction of cultural vitality amidst political weakness would define the Greek world at the very moment that a new force was rising across the Adriatic Sea. That force was Rome. At the dawn of the 3rd century BCE, Rome was still a republic finding its feet. It had only just secured dominance in Italy, and to the Greeks, it was a curiosity, a power from the West with strange institutions and unfamiliar customs. Rome was not a monarchy, nor a kingdom, nor a city-state in the traditional Greek sense. It was something new, a republic in which power was shared among elected magistrates, a senate, and assemblies of citizens. Its strength lay not in wealth or cultural prestige, but in discipline, resilience, and an uncanny ability to absorb losses and return stronger. The Greeks looked east to the vast realms of the Seleucids and Ptolemies, or north to the enduring power of Macedon. Few bothered to look west to Italy, where Rome was consolidating power with relentless determination. And yet, as the Greeks exhausted themselves in dynastic feuds, Rome was building the very qualities that would soon allow it to intervene in Greek affairs: a battle-hardened army, a flexible system of alliances, and a political culture that thrived on expansion. When Rome eventually crossed into the Greek world, it would not find the united, self-confident Greece that had once stood against Persia. It would not face the league of city-states that had triumphed at Marathon, Salamis, or Plataea. It would find a Greece divided between kings and leagues, led by endless wars, and increasingly willing to invite foreign powers into its disputes. Rome would be summoned not first as conqueror, but as arbiter. And once Rome set foot on Greek soil, it would never leave. The vulnerability of the Greek world after Alexander was not obvious to contemporaries. To many, the Hellenistic kingdoms seemed unstoppable. Their armies were vast, their cities glittering with wealth. Yet their foundations were brittle. They lacked the deep reservoirs of citizen soldiers that had once defended the city-states. They relied on mercenaries, on dynastic marriages, on fragile balances of power. Their rulers were often more concerned with dynastic squabbles than with the defense of Greece as a whole. And so, by the time Rome arrived, the Greeks were caught in a trap of their own making. Their wealth and prestige disguised their weakness. Their divisions made them easy to manipulate. Their reliance on kings made them easy to dominate. It is in this paradox, brilliance on the surface, fragility beneath, that we must understand the story of how Rome conquered Greece. For Greece was not overrun in a single battle, nor crushed by a sudden invasion. It was undone gradually, piece by piece, as Rome exploited divisions, turned allies into subjects, and replaced old institutions with its own. When Alexander died, he had left behind a vision of a world united under Greek leadership. But his successors, instead of preserving that vision, tore it apart. And into the ruins of that vision, Rome would step, claiming not only Greece's lands, but eventually Greece's culture, philosophy, and identity. In the end, Greece after Alexander was a world in transition, a world dazzling to behold, but crumbling within. It was this Greece, weakened and divided, that Rome encountered. And it was this Greece that would fall, not all at once, but steadily, until its independence was extinguished and its legacy absorbed into a new empire that would rule the Mediterranean for centuries to come. The first time Rome's destiny collided with the Greek world, it was not on the plains of Macedon, nor in the temples of Athens. It was in the rugged hills of southern Italy, where the Republic was still testing the limits of its power. The Greeks did not yet see Rome as a conqueror, nor as a rival. Instead, they saw it as one among many barbarian peoples of the West, stubborn, provincial, and rough. But in the early 3rd century BCE, a chain of events would bring Rome face to face with a figure who embodied the last echoes of Alexander's world, Pyrrhus of Epirus. Pyrrhus was no ordinary king. He was kin to Alexander through marriage and styled himself as the heir to the great conqueror's legacy. Born in 319 BCE, in the turbulent years after Alexander's death, he was raised in a world defined by intrigue, war, and shifting alliances. Ambitious, restless, and brilliant on the battlefield, Pyrrhus dreamed not of ruling a small kingdom in northwestern Greece, but of emulating the great campaigns of Alexander himself. His opportunity came when the Greek cities of southern Italy, known collectively as Magna Graecia, found themselves under pressure. These cities, founded centuries earlier by Greek colonists, had long prospered along Italy's southern coasts. Tarentum, the wealthiest and most powerful among them, had grown anxious at Rome's rising influence. By the year 282 BCE, Tarentum clashed openly with Rome, sinking Roman ships that had dared to enter its waters. Knowing they could not resist Rome alone, the Tarentines called for help from across the sea. They appealed to Pyrrhus, the ambitious king who longed for a chance to prove himself. Pyrrhus answered eagerly. Here was a chance to test his mettle against a new power, to carve out dominion in Italy, and perhaps to use Italy as a springboard for grander ambition, Sicily, Carthage, even a return to Macedon. In 280 BCE, Pyrrhus sailed across the Ionian Sea with a force that was small by Alexandrian standards, but formidable to the Italians: 25,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, and most famously, 20 war elephants. For the Romans, who had never faced elephants in battle, these beasts would be as terrifying as they were unfamiliar. The clash came at Heraclea, on the banks of the Cirrus River. The Roman legions, hardened by wars in Italy, advanced with discipline and determination. They fought in maniples, small, flexible units rather than in the rigid ranks of a phalanx. The battle raged fiercely, and for a time, it seemed the Romans might overwhelm their Greek adversaries. But then Pyrrhus unleashed his elephants. The enormous animals crashed into the Roman lines, scattering horses and men alike. Panic spread, and the Romans broke. Pyrrhus had won his first battle against Rome. Yet victory came at a price. Thousands of his men lay dead, and the Romans, though defeated, were not crushed. Unlike other enemies who might sue for peace after such a loss, the Romans regrouped, raised new armies, and prepared to fight again. Pyrrhus, who had campaigned alongside Hellenistic armies his entire life, had never seen such resilience. Where other people yielded, Rome endured. The next year, the two sides met again at Asculum. Once more, the Romans pressed their advantage. Once more the elephants turned the tide, and once more Pyrrhus emerged victorious. But the cost was crippling. Pyrrhus lost so many veteran men and officers that he could not replace them. When he was congratulated on his victory, he is said to have remarked, "If we are victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined." From this bitter irony, history remembers the phrase Pyrrhic victory, a triumph so costly it amounts to defeat. Realizing that endless war in Italy would drain him, Pyrrhus shifted his ambitions. He accepted an invitation from Greek cities in Sicily to defend them against Carthage. For 3 years, he campaigned across the island, driving the Carthaginians back and nearly expelling them altogether. But his harsh rule and endless demands for resources alienated his allies. The Sicilians, once eager for his protection, now resented his presence. Disillusioned, Pyrrhus abandoned Sicily and returned to Italy. By 275 BCE, the decisive confrontation came at Beneventum. The Romans had learned from their earlier defeats. They stood firm against Pyrrhus' elephants, adapting their tactics to counter the beasts. When the battle ended, the advantage was with Rome. Pyrrhus withdrew, his dream of dominating Italy in ruins. Within a few years, he was killed in street fighting in Argos after an inglorious skirmish. Pyrrhus' campaigns had revealed something profound to the Greek world. Here was a man trained in the traditions of Alexander, commanding Macedonian phalanxes and elephants, wielding the prestige of Hellenistic kingship, and yet he had failed to break Rome. The Republic had suffered defeats, yes, but each time it recovered. Rome was unlike the kingdoms of the East. It did not collapse after a lost battle. It endured, and in enduring, it triumphed. For the Greeks of southern Italy, Pyrrhus' failure was disastrous. One by one, their cities fell under Roman control. Tarentum was captured in 272 BCE. With its fall, Rome secured dominance over Magna Graecia. The Greek cities of Italy, once proud and independent, now found themselves subjects of the Roman Republic. This was Rome's first real encounter with the Greek world, not yet in the Aegean, but in the colonies of Italy. And it was here that both sides began to understand one another. For the Romans, it was a lesson in the sophistication and power of Greek warfare, as well as an introduction to Greek culture. They encountered Greek art, philosophy, and religion in these cities, and though they conquered them, they also absorbed their influence. For the Greeks, it was a glimpse of a rising power they had underestimated. Rome was no longer just a local Italian force. It was a republic whose resilience and ambition hinted at far greater things to come. Though Pyrrhus returned to Greece with his reputation battered, the story of his battles with Rome spread across the Hellenistic world. Kings and generals began to take notice. A new player had entered the stage of Mediterranean politics, and it was only a matter of time before its legions marched across the Adriatic itself. In retrospect, Pyrrhus' campaigns marked the beginning of a slow but inexorable process. Rome had tested itself against a descendant of Alexander's world and found itself equal, if not superior. It had learned to fight elephants, to endure the phalanx, to adapt to new enemies. And most importantly, it had gained a foothold in the Greek imagination. The Roman conquest of Greece would not come for another century, but the seeds were sown here, in the clash between Pyrrhus of Epirus and the legions of Rome. When Pyrrhus looked across the battlefield and saw that even in defeat the Romans did not break, he glimpsed what others would only later understand. Rome could not be stopped by victory alone. To defeat Rome, one had to break its spirit, and that no king in the Greek world would ever accomplish. When the Roman Republic first turned its gaze eastward across the Adriatic, it was not out of ambition, but out of necessity. The clash that would be remembered as the First Macedonian War was born not from Rome's hunger for empire, but from the desperate struggle for survival against an enemy that had brought the Republic to the brink of destruction. In 218 BCE, Hannibal Barca of Carthage crossed the Alps and descended into Italy with an army unlike any Rome had ever faced. His elephants, his hardened veterans from Spain and North Africa, his brilliance as a commander, these shattered Rome's confidence in the opening years of the Second Punic War. At Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, Hannibal annihilated Roman armies, leaving tens of thousands of legionaries dead upon the fields of Italy. The Republic staggered, its allies wavered, and for the first time, the survival of Rome itself was in doubt. It was in this moment of crisis that Philip V of Macedon saw his opportunity. Philip was the young and ambitious king of the Antigonid dynasty, ruling from Pella, the ancient seat of Alexander's forebears. To the Greeks, he represented continuity, the latest in a long line of Macedonian kings who claimed the mantle of leadership in the Hellenic world. But Philip's ambitions stretched further than mere guardianship of Greece. He sought to expand Macedonian power westward, to reclaim a measure of the prestige that had faded since Alexander's death. The collapse of Roman power in Italy seemed to open that door. When news of Cannae spread, a catastrophe so great that Romans feared their city would be stormed, Philip calculated that Rome might finally be vulnerable to a strike from the east. And so, in 215 BCE, he concluded an alliance with Hannibal. Macedon and Carthage, together, would squeeze Rome from both sides of the Adriatic. For Rome, already reeling from disaster after disaster, the news of this alliance was alarming. Hannibal was enough of a threat within Italy. The possibility of Macedonian armies landing in southern Italy, or of Greek fleets raiding the Adriatic, was intolerable. Rome could not afford another enemy. And so, even as it fought for its life against Carthage, it began to prepare for war with Macedon. The First Macedonian War was unlike the titanic battles that would later decide the fate of Greece. It was a war of maneuver, raids, and limited engagements. Rome, overstretched in Italy, could spare only small forces for campaigns in the Balkans. It relied heavily on alliances with the Aetolian League, with Pergamon in Asia Minor, and with smaller Greek states that feared Macedonian dominance. For these allies, Rome was not yet a conqueror, but a useful counterweight, a distant power that could be invited to check Philip without threatening their independence. Philip, for his part, struggled to project his power effectively across the Adriatic. His fleet was harried by Roman ships, his attempts to land in Italy thwarted. Instead, the war bogged down into a series of campaigns in Illyria and northern Greece, with neither side able to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Though inconclusive, the war revealed much about the world to come. For the first time, Rome was formally entangled in Greek affairs. No longer confined to Italy, it had inserted itself into the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined the Hellenistic world. And once Rome had entered, it would not easily withdraw. The conclusion of the war came in 205 BCE with the Treaty of Phalanx. Neither side could claim outright victory. Rome, exhausted by its struggle with Hannibal, sought to limit commitments abroad. Philip, checked by Roman resistance and the defection of allies, accepted peace. The terms restored the status quo. Rome retained its allies, Philip retained his throne, and Greece remained divided. To contemporaries, the war may have seemed a sideshow, a distraction from the great struggle between Rome and Carthage. But in hindsight, the First Macedonian War marked a profound shift. For centuries, Greece had looked east to Persia, to the successors of Alexander, to the wealth of Egypt and Asia. Now, for the first time, a power from the west had intervened decisively in Greek politics. The Adriatic, once a barrier, had become a bridge. The war also revealed something essential about Rome's approach to foreign conflict. Rome did not simply fight alone. It built coalitions, weaving itself into the disputes of others and turning those disputes to its advantage. By aligning with the Aetolians, Pergamon, and Rhodes, it had made itself indispensable to factions within Greece. This strategy, entering as an ally, leaving as a master, would become the hallmark of Rome's expansion in the Hellenistic world. For Philip V, the war was a bitter lesson. He had sought to exploit Rome's weakness, but instead, he had made Rome his enemy. Worse, he had given Rome a reason to stay involved in Greece. Though he survived the war, his ambitions in the West were frustrated, and his rivals in Greece had grown stronger with Roman support. For Rome, the war was proof that it could project power across the Adriatic, even while fighting for survival against Hannibal. It had shown that Macedon, for all its prestige, was not invincible. And it had begun the process by which Greek affairs would become inextricably tied to Roman interests. When the dust settled in 205 BCE, the Treaty of Phoenix brought a fragile peace. But beneath the surface, the stage was set for future conflict. The Second Punic War would end with Hannibal's defeat at Zama in 202 BCE. And when Rome emerged from that struggle, triumphant and unchallenged in the West, its attention would once again turn eastward. This time, it would not be distracted. This time, it would bring the full weight of its legions to bear. The First Macedonian War, though indecisive, was the opening act in a century of struggle that would end with Greece under Roman rule. It was the first hint of a pattern that would repeat again and again. Greek kings overestimating their strength, underestimating Rome's resilience, and calling upon alliances that only deepened Rome's entanglement in their world. In the shadows of Hannibal's war, a new conflict had quietly begun, one that would shape the fate of Greece for generations. The old order, fractured and vulnerable since Alexander's death, had now drawn the attention of a republic that knew no limits to its endurance. From this point onward, the destinies of Rome and Greece would be bound together, and the question was no longer whether Rome would intervene in Greek affairs, but when and how completely it would take control. The uneasy peace that followed the Treaty of Phoenix in 205 BCE was little more than a pause. Beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Rome had survived Hannibal, defeated Carthage at Zama, and emerged as the preeminent power of the Western Mediterranean. But Philip V of Macedon, restless and emboldened, was not content with the status quo. Even as Rome struggled against Carthage, Philip had turned his eyes eastward. He pressed into the Aegean, threatening the islands and clashing with the rising naval power of Rhodes. He probed the borders of Asia Minor, challenging the authority of the Attalids of Pergamon. His expansion brought him into conflict not only with his Greek rivals, but with the great Seleucid Empire, which was itself maneuvering under the ambitious king Antiochus III. To Philip, the vacuum left by the waning of Ptolemaic Egypt presented an opportunity. To Rome, however, his actions looked dangerously like the re-emergence of a great Hellenistic empire that could challenge Roman security. The trigger for renewed conflict came when Pergamon and Rhodes, both threatened by Macedonian aggression, appealed to Rome for aid. Rome's Senate, victorious and confident after Carthage's fall, now faced a choice. Should it remain confined to Italy and the Western Mediterranean, or should it involve itself once more in the quarrels of the East? The decision was not inevitable. Many Romans saw Greece as distant and irrelevant, but the Senate had learned a lesson from the First Macedonian War. Macedon could not be ignored. To allow Philip free rein would embolden him and might invite him once again into Italy's orbit. And so, in 200 BCE, Rome declared war on Macedon. This was the beginning of the Second Macedonian War. Unlike the first conflict, Rome entered the Second Macedonian War with full resources at its disposal. The Punic threat was gone. Hannibal was defeated. Rome's armies were free, disciplined, and eager for glory. The Republic could now commit legions and strength to the Balkans. Philip, however, was no mere provincial enemy. He commanded the Macedonian phalanx, the great innovation of Philip II and Alexander the Great, a wall of spears that had dominated battlefields for centuries. To many, the phalanx was still the ultimate instrument of Greek warfare. As Roman legions crossed the Adriatic and marched through Thessaly, the world watched. For the first time, two military systems, Rome's flexible manipular legion and Greece's phalanx, would meet in open battle. It was a clash of doctrines as much as of armies. The war dragged on for several years. Rome secured alliances with the Aetolian League, Pergamon, Rhodes, and other Greek states eager to curb Philip's power. Macedon found itself isolated, its strength strained by fighting on multiple fronts. Campaigns in Thessaly and central Greece tested both sides, but no decisive encounter emerged until 197 BCE, when the armies converged near the hills of Cynoscephalae in Thessaly. The very name Cynoscephalae means dog's heads, a reference to the chain of rolling hills that define the terrain. It was here, on mist-shrouded slopes, that the Macedonian phalanx and the Roman legions would collide. Philip V, seeking a decisive engagement, drew up his phalanx on the uneven ground. His army was formidable, a mass of men bristling with sarissas, pikes over 5 meters long, forming an impenetrable hedge of spear points. For centuries, such a formation had swept aside all opposition. The Romans, under the consul Titus Quinctius Flamininus, arrayed their legions against this ancient machine of war. Flamininus was not merely a soldier. He was a statesman, young, ambitious, and eager to make his name in the East. He understood that this battle would not only decide the war, but also determine Rome's reputation in Greece. At first, fortune favored Macedon. On one wing, Philip's phalanx advanced downhill, driving back the Roman line with the irresistible weight of its pikes. The sheer momentum of the Macedonian charge threatened to overwhelm the Romans. But the phalanx had a weakness. It was rigid, unwieldy, and vulnerable on rough ground. As the formation pressed forward, gaps opened. On Philip's other wing, the phalanx struggled to deploy on broken terrain. Roman troops, nimble and adaptable, seized the moment. They poured into the gaps, attacking the Macedonians from the side and rear. A Roman officer is said to have shouted, "This is not war with spears, but with swords." The legionaries, armed with their short gladii, darted beneath the sarissas and hacked at the exposed flanks of the Macedonian soldiers. Once the phalanx lost its cohesion, its strength was broken. Panic spread. Philip's army collapsed. Thousands were slain, others taken prisoner, and the great phalanx that had once conquered Asia lay shattered on the hills of Cynoscephalae. The victory was total. Macedon was forced to surrender most of its possessions in Greece, pay a heavy indemnity, and submit to Rome's conditions. Yet what Rome did next shocked the Greek world. At the Isthmian Games in 196 BCE, Titus Flamininus stood before a crowd of Greeks and declared that Rome was not here to conquer, but to liberate. The cities of Greece, he announced, would be free and autonomous, without garrisons and without tribute. The audience erupted in celebration. To the Greeks, weary of centuries under Macedonian domination, Rome seemed not an oppressor, but a deliverer. Statues of Flamininus were raised, his name praised as the new champion of Hellenic freedom. But behind this proclamation lay cold calculation. By proclaiming freedom, Rome did not withdraw from Greek affairs. It entrenched itself deeper. The Greek states, though technically independent, were now bound by gratitude, obligation, and the looming shadow of Roman power. Whenever disputes arose, as they always did, it would be Rome, and only Rome, that could arbitrate them. The Battle of Cynoscephalae was more than a military victory. It was a symbolic moment in world history. The Macedonian phalanx, the weapon of Alexander, had been decisively defeated by the Roman legion. The old order of warfare was over. Philip V retained his throne, but Macedon was humbled, its ambitions curtailed. The balance of power in Greece had shifted irrevocably. Rome was no longer a distant ally. It was the arbiter of Greek politics. For the Greeks, the promise of freedom proved intoxicating. But freedom under Rome was not the same as true independence. The Republic had shown that it could cross the Adriatic at will, defeat the mightiest kings of Greece, and dictate terms. The illusion of autonomy would not last long. For Rome, the war was a revelation. The legions had not only withstood the phalanx, they had annihilated it. Confidence soared. Senators and generals looked eastward with new ambition. If Macedon could be defeated, what of the Seleucids? What of the Ptolemies? The Mediterranean world, it seemed, lay open before them. The Second Macedonian War ended with Rome triumphant, Philip humbled, and Greece celebrating its supposed liberation. Yet beneath the cheers and garlands, the truth was plain. Rome was now master of the Greek world in all but name. And once Rome had entered, it would never leave. The defeat of Philip V at Cynoscephalae in 197 BCE had shifted the balance of power in Greece forever. Rome, once a distant Western republic, now loomed as the great arbiter of Hellenic affairs. Yet Macedon's fall did not mean peace for Greece. Instead, the vacuum left by Philip's humiliation invited the attention of an even greater monarch, Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire. If Philip had dreamed of dominating the Greek world, Antiochus envisioned something larger. His kingdom stretched from the Aegean to the borders of India. He was heir to the vast eastern conquests of Alexander, ruler of Asia, and in his own mind, the destined savior of Greece against Rome's encroachment. By the early 2nd century BCE, Antiochus III had earned his epithet, the Great. He had restored Seleucid control over rebellious provinces, campaigned into Bactria, and pressed into Anatolia. His armies had marched further east than any king since Alexander. Victories over the Ptolemies had given him dominance in Syria and Coele-Syria. To friend and foe alike, Antiochus seemed a monarch of immense ambition, seeking to knit together a vast empire from the fragments of Alexander's world. But power in the east was fragile. The Seleucid Empire was sprawling, unstable, and perpetually threatened by revolts and the ambitions of neighboring states. To secure his legacy, Antiochus looked west toward Greece, the land that had once given birth to Alexander's conquests. And there he found opportunity. By a twist of fate, Antiochus also came into contact with one of Rome's greatest enemies, Hannibal Barca. Defeated at Zama but unbroken in spirit, Hannibal had fled into exile and found refuge at the Seleucid court. There, he urged Antiochus to take up arms against Rome. The Republic, Hannibal argued, was overextended, its strength strained by constant wars. Now was the moment to strike. To many Greeks, Antiochus seemed the perfect champion. Macedon was humbled, Rome was overbearing, and here was a king with the resources of Asia behind him, promising liberation. Cities in central Greece, particularly the Aetolian League, began to whisper of alliance. Rome's proclamation of Greek freedom after Cynoscephalae rang hollow in the ears of those who saw legions stationed nearby. Antiochus offered something more intoxicating, the chance to drive Rome out altogether. In 192 BCE, Antiochus crossed into Greece, answering the call of the Aetolian League. He landed with an army of perhaps 10,000 men, hardly enough to overthrow Rome, but sufficient to rally discontented Greeks to his banner. His arrival set off a chain reaction of anxiety across the Mediterranean. To the Romans, this was intolerable. A king of Asia, styling himself the heir of Alexander, had planted his standard on Greek soil. The Senate declared war, and legions marched once more across the Adriatic. The so-called Roman, Seleucid War had begun. Antiochus' first stand came at Thermopylae, the same narrow pass where Leonidas and his Spartans had resisted Xerxes nearly 3 centuries before. The symbolism was powerful. Here, Antiochus sought to cast himself as the new defender of Greece against foreign invaders. His army fortified the pass, confident that the Romans could not break through. But history did not repeat itself. Rome had studied the lessons of the past. Just as Xerxes had once outflanked the Spartans through mountain paths, so too did Roman forces bypass Antiochus' defenses. Attacked from multiple directions, the Seleucid lines collapsed. Antiochus fled back across the Aegean, abandoning Greece to its fate. The grand savior had been revealed as a pretender. Yet Rome was not content with merely repelling him. If Antiochus had dared to set foot in Greece, Rome would have pursued him into Asia itself. In 190 BCE, a Roman army crossed into Asia Minor, an audacious move that stunned the Hellenistic world. For centuries, the great kings of the East had threatened the West. Now, for the first time, An Italian power projected its strength across the sea, challenging the might of Asia on its own soil. Allies rallied to Rome's side. Pergamon, Rhodes, and other states, fearful of Seleucid dominance, threw in their lot with the legions. Antiochus, though still commanding vast resources, struggled to muster the unity and loyalty his empire required. His Greek allies had abandoned him after Thermopylae. Now, in Asia, he faced Rome largely alone. The climax came near the town of Magnesia ad Sipylum in western Anatolia. Antiochus assembled a massive force, perhaps 70,000 strong, including cavalry, elephants, and phalanxes in the old Macedonian style. Rome's army, led by Lucius Cornelius Scipio, brother of Scipio Africanus, was smaller but disciplined and confident. The battle that followed in 190 BCE was one of the most decisive in antiquity. Antiochus attempted to overwhelm the Roman flanks with cavalry and elephants, but his charges faltered. The elephants panicked under missile fire, trampling their own men. The Seleucid phalanx, though formidable, proved vulnerable to the same tactics that had undone Philip at Cynoscephalae. Roman maniples slipped into the gaps, hacking apart the rigid lines. As the day wore on, the Seleucid army dissolved into chaos. Antiochus himself fled the field. Tens of thousands were slain or captured. The great king was humiliated. The aftermath was catastrophic for the Seleucids. In 188 BCE, Antiochus was forced to accept the Treaty of Apamea, one of the harshest settlements in ancient history. He surrendered all territory west of the Taurus Mountains, paid a crushing indemnity, and agreed to hand over his war elephants and navy. Even worse, he was compelled to give hostages to Rome, including his own son, the future Antiochus for Epiphanes. The Seleucid Empire, once a contender for Alexander's mantle, was broken. Its influence in Greece evaporated. Rome had demonstrated not only that it could defeat Macedon, but that it could humble the greatest empire of the East on its own ground. For the Greeks, Antiochus' failure was a sobering lesson. The dream of a foreign savior who could free them from Roman dominance had evaporated. The Aetolian League, which had invited Antiochus, was punished and diminished. Other states, fearful of Rome's wrath, drew closer into its orbit. Rome, for its part, proclaimed once again that it sought no empire, no dominion over Greek cities, only peace. Yet the truth was plain for all to see. With Macedon cowed and the Seleucids defeated, no power remained capable of challenging Rome in the Greek world. Independence was becoming little more than a memory. The Roman-Seleucid War revealed more than the weakness of Antiochus. It showed the inexorable logic of Roman expansion. Again and again, the Republic claimed only to defend itself, only to aid allies, only to restore freedom. Yet with each war, its legions marched further, its influence deepened, and its rivals were left in ruins. Antiochus returned to his eastern dominions, where he would eventually die while plundering a temple to pay Rome's indemnities. His empire, once vast and ambitious, began its long decline, fractured by internal strife and external enemies. Greece watched and waited, but the truth was clear. The contest for supremacy was over. Rome had faced both Macedon and the Seleucids and emerged supreme. The old Hellenistic kingdoms were crumbling, one by one, before the discipline of the legions. The stage was now set for the final act, the fall of Macedon itself, and the destruction of Greek independence. The defeat of Antiochus III at Magnesia had confirmed what many in Greece already suspected. Rome was now the decisive power in the eastern Mediterranean. Yet even after the Seleucid king withdrew in humiliation, one ancient dynasty still clung to its pride. Macedon, though humbled at Cynoscephalae, had not been erased. Its king, Philip V, remained on the throne, chastened but watchful, and his son Perseus grew to manhood in a world already overshadowed by Rome. It was Perseus who would inherit Macedon's last gamble for independence, and in his failure, Greece's fate would be sealed forever. Philip's final years were those of a man haunted by lost glory. His kingdom was diminished, his prestige shattered, his ambitions thwarted by Rome's dictates. He had been forced to abandon much of his power in Greece, to pay indemnities, and to send hostages to Italy. The once mighty heir of Alexander's line now ruled as little more than a client king, tolerated so long as he obeyed the will of Rome. Yet even under these humiliations, Philip tried to preserve something of Macedon's dignity. He reformed his finances, rebuilt his armies, and nurtured a sense of pride in his young heir. When he died in 179 BCE, the hopes of his people rested on Perseus. The new king was not without talent. Perseus was intelligent, careful, and conscious of the need to avoid reckless confrontations. He cultivated allies in Greece, sought to restore Macedon's influence through diplomacy, and even arranged advantageous marriages to strengthen his position. Yet beneath his caution lay a simmering resentment. Perseus could not forget that Macedon was no longer master of Greece, but its servant. For a time, his careful balancing act succeeded. Some cities, weary of Roman interference, began to look once more toward Macedon. Rome, distracted by affairs elsewhere, tolerated Perseus' maneuvers. But as his popularity grew, so too did Roman suspicion. The Republic's Senate, sensitive to even the faintest hint of rivalry, began to see Perseus as a threat that must be extinguished. By 171 BCE, tensions erupted into the Third Macedonian War. Once again, legions crossed into Greece. Perseus sought to resist, rallying support where he could, but the old divisions of the Greek world betrayed him. Some cities sided with Rome, hoping to preserve their autonomy. Others hesitated, fearful of Rome's wrath. Macedon, isolated and outnumbered, faced the full weight of the Republic's power. The war dragged on for several years, with both sides maneuvering across the rugged hills of Greece. Perseus scored some early successes, even inflicting minor defeats on Roman detachments, which gave heart to those who still believed in Macedon's strength. Yet these victories were fleeting. Rome's resources were vast, its manpower seemingly inexhaustible. What Macedon could achieve in a single campaign season, Rome could replace many times over. Perseus, increasingly desperate, withdrew to defend his homeland. It was in 168 BCE, near the small town of Pydna, that the two sides would meet for the final reckoning. The field of Pydna lay beneath the shadow of Mount Olympus, on open plains cut by uneven ground. It was summer, and the sun beat down upon the assembled armies with relentless force. On one side stood Perseus with perhaps 44,000 men, the great phalanx of Macedon, supported by cavalry and auxiliaries, the last echo of Alexander's conquering host. On the other side stood Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the Roman consul, with roughly the same number of troops, legions hardened by years of campaigning, disciplined and confident in their commander. Both armies knew that this battle would decide not only the war, but the destiny of Greece itself. As the day wore on, the Macedonian phalanx advanced. Thousands of sarissas lowered in unison, a glittering wall of steel pushing forward with relentless power. For a time, the Romans buckled under the pressure. The sheer weight of the phalanx seemed irresistible, its spear points driving back the legionaries, its ordered ranks grinding forward like a living machine. Perseus, watching from a nearby position, must have believed that victory was within his grasp, that the old weapon of Macedon could still dominate the battlefield as it had under his ancestors. But the ground at Pydna was not smooth. As the phalanx advanced across the uneven terrain, its formation began to warp. Small gaps opened between the dense files of spearmen as they struggled to keep their alignment on rough ground. What to the Macedonians seemed a minor disruption appeared to the Romans as an opportunity. Aemilius Paulus, experienced and perceptive, recognized the moment. He ordered his maniples to surge into the openings. The legion was not a wall, but a collection of flexible units, each able to fight independently. Roman soldiers darted into the cracks in the phalanx, their short swords flashing beneath the long spears. Once inside the formation, the advantage shifted instantly. The sarissa, so deadly when leveled in unison, was useless at close quarters. Macedonian soldiers found themselves unable to maneuver, their lines broken, their cohesion lost. Roman gladii stabbed upward into unarmored thighs and stomachs. The rigid phalanx dissolved into chaos. What followed was slaughter. Roman soldiers cut through the fragmented Macedonian ranks, hacking down men who could no longer hold formation. Cavalry charges scattered Perseus' remaining reserves. Panic spread across the field. By nightfall, the once proud phalanx was annihilated. 20,000 Macedonians lay dead. Another 11,000 were captured. Perseus himself fled the field, abandoning his men. The dream of resistance was over. In the aftermath, Perseus was hunted down and captured. He was brought in chains to Rome, where he was paraded in Aemilius Paulus' triumph, a spectacle of humiliation that marked the symbolic end of Macedon as a sovereign power. The kingdom was divided into 4 republics, its monarchy abolished, its people subjected to Rome's will. The line of Philip and Alexander, which had once ruled from the Balkans to India, now ended in disgrace. The Battle of Pydna was more than the defeat of a king. It was the death of a tradition. For 2 centuries, the phalanx had been the engine of conquest, the formation that had carried Alexander to the edges of the known world. Its annihilation at Pydna demonstrated beyond doubt that the age of the phalanx was finished. The legion, adaptable and disciplined, had proven itself the superior instrument of war. From this point onward, Rome would not only dominate Greece, but would stand as the unrivaled military power of the Mediterranean. For the Greeks, the consequences were profound. Macedon had been the last great barrier to Roman supremacy. With its fall, no Greek state possessed the strength to resist. Independence was now a memory, autonomy an illusion. Rome had broken the backbone of Hellenic power. In the decades to come, Greek cities would rebel, resist, and plead for freedom, but Pydna had already decided the outcome. Rome was master, and Greece, though not yet annexed as a province, was Rome's in all but name. Yet even in victory, the Romans looked upon what they had destroyed with a strange reverence. Aemilius Paulus, surveying the field after the battle, is said to have marveled at the bravery and discipline of the Macedonian soldiers, even in their defeat. To him, as to many Romans, there was both triumph and tragedy in the fall of Macedon. The conquerors could not help but respect the legacy of the conquered. Thus ended the final gamble of the Antigonid dynasty. Perseus, dragged in chains through the streets of Rome, was the last Macedonian king. His fall marked not only the end of his kingdom, but the end of Greece's ability to determine its own fate. From Pydna onward, the story of Greece would be written in Latin as much as in Greek, its future bound to the destiny of Rome. In the year 146 BCE, Greece stood at the edge of ruin. For decades, the Greek city-states had lived in the long shadow of Rome, their independence preserved in name but not in substance. The wars with Macedon and the Seleucids had shown them the reality. Rome could not be challenged. Yet, in the southern Peloponnese, there remained one final spark of resistance. The Achaean League, a coalition of Greek cities, still spoke the language of freedom, still clung to the memory of independence. They were not willing to bow quietly, and their defiance would lead to catastrophe. The Achaean League had once been a symbol of Greek unity, born in the 3rd century BCE as a federation to protect the autonomy of small polis against the domination of larger powers. It was democratic in spirit, a reminder of the ideals of the classical age, but by the mid-2nd century BCE, Its ambitions had far outgrown its strength. The League dreamed of restoring Greece's dignity, of resisting foreign overlords, whether Macedonian or Roman. Yet it was hopelessly divided. Some cities sought compromise, others urged defiance, and all the while, Rome watched with cold calculation. In 147 BCE, tensions boiled over. The Achaeans, furious at Roman interference in Greek affairs, rose in revolt. They declared that no city of Greece would remain under Rome's dictates. It was an act of desperation, born less of strength than of pride. The Romans, who had tolerated unrest before, now resolved to act decisively. This was no longer a matter of policing allies. It was a matter of setting an example of crushing, once and for all, the illusion that Greek independence could be revived. The Roman Senate dispatched an army under Lucius Mummius, a commander not famed for brilliance but tasked with overwhelming force. The legions swept into the Peloponnese with brutal efficiency. Battles were fought near Leucopetra and Scarpheia, where the Greek forces, poorly armed and hastily gathered, stood little chance against the discipline and experience of Rome. The revolt crumbled as quickly as it had risen. City after city fell, and soon, all eyes turned to one place: Corinth. Corinth was no ordinary city. Perched on the narrow isthmus between mainland Greece and the Peloponnese, it was both wealthy and strategically vital. Its harbors thrived with trade, its markets glittered with luxury, and its citizens were proud of their role as guardians of the Greek world. To the Romans, Corinth was more than just another rebellious polis. It was a symbol, and symbols must be destroyed. In the spring of 146 BCE, the Roman legions encircled the city. The defenders, numbering only a fraction of Rome's strength, fought with desperation. Yet resistance was futile. When the walls were breached, chaos swept through the streets. Corinth burned. The men were slaughtered, the women and children dragged into slavery, the treasures of the city carted off to adorn Roman triumphs. Temples that had stood for centuries were stripped bare. Statues of gods and heroes were seized, their beauty destined for distant villas in Italy. The city that had once been the jewel of Greece was reduced to ash and silence. For the Greeks who survived, the sack of Corinth was more than the loss of a city. It was the death of an idea. The dream of autonomy, nurtured since the days of Marathon and Thermopylae, was extinguished in fire and blood. From this moment onward, Greece would no longer be a collection of independent states. It would be a land subject to Rome, its fate tied to the will of the Senate and its generals. The year 146 BCE holds another shadow as well. Far away in the western Mediterranean, Rome unleashed its fury upon another ancient rival, Carthage. For 3 long wars, Carthage had threatened Rome's existence. Now, at last, the city was annihilated. Its walls leveled, its population enslaved, its very name cursed by Roman decree. In the same year, in 2 different corners of the Mediterranean, Rome struck down the twin symbols of resistance: Carthage in the west, Corinth in the east. The Mediterranean world had entered a new age. The destruction of Corinth shocked the Hellenistic world. Neighboring kingdoms like Pergamon, Rhodes, and the Seleucids watched in silence. Rome's message was unmistakable. Those who submitted could prosper as allies. Those who defied would be obliterated. The balance of power that had once shaped the Hellenistic era, the dance of kingdoms and leagues, the rivalries of kings, was gone. Rome was now the arbiter of destiny. And yet, for all its brutality, Rome did not abandon Greece to chaos. In the aftermath, Roman administrators imposed order. Corinth was left in ruins for a century, a grim reminder of Roman wrath. But elsewhere, cities were spared further punishment if they pledged obedience. Rome preferred stability, not endless destruction. The Greeks were not exterminated, but absorbed slowly, inexorably into the framework of Roman power. In the decades that followed, Greek culture endured even under Roman dominance. Philosophers continued to teach, poets continued to write, and artists continued to create. But the sack of Corinth lingered in memory as a turning point. For centuries, Greeks would remember it as the moment the last embers of independence were stamped out, when the proudest city of their land was reduced to nothing, and when the name of Rome became both feared and inescapable. Thus ended the final chapter of Greek freedom. What Alexander's empire had failed to preserve, what the city-states had failed to defend, was extinguished in 146 BCE. The Roman conquest of Greece was not achieved with a single blow, but with a relentless tightening grip. Each war, each battle, each act of defiance met with overwhelming force. Corinth was the last spark, and in its ashes, Rome declared itself master of the Greek world. When the smoke cleared from Corinth and the cries of its enslaved people faded into silence, it seemed as if Greece had been utterly broken. Its cities subdued, its armies crushed, its independence extinguished. And yet, paradoxically, this was not the end of Greece's story. For while Rome had conquered Greece with the sword, it was Greece that would, in the decades and centuries to come, conquer Rome with the mind. The men who marched into Greece returned not only with plundered treasure, but with ideas, philosophies, and art that would reshape the very heart of Roman civilization. The sack of Corinth may have been an act of devastation, but it also opened a floodgate. Statues of bronze and marble were dragged to Italy, their grace adorning villas and temples. Scrolls of philosophy and history found their way into the libraries of Rome. Greek teachers, once enslaved, soon became tutors to the sons of senators and generals. To the Romans, Greece was both defeated and yet impossibly alluring. They had proved their superiority in arms, but they could not deny the brilliance of Greek culture. For centuries, Greece had been the crucible of philosophy, science, and the arts. Rome's victories had delivered into its hands not only territory, but a legacy of intellect and beauty that it could neither destroy nor ignore. A Roman general might sneer at Greek softness, but his children would learn Greek as their second tongue. This absorption began slowly, almost unconsciously. In the early years, Roman senators prided themselves on their stern, practical traditions. They looked down on what they saw as Greek decadence. Cato the Elder, a man of uncompromising Roman virtue, famously warned that Greek philosophers would corrupt Roman youth. Yet even Cato could not halt the tide. His speeches against Greek culture were themselves filled with references to Greek models, and his sons were taught by Greek tutors. In time, the very men who had once destroyed Greek independence became its most fervent admirers. Philosophy was the first and most profound gift Greece gave to Rome. The doctrines of Plato and Aristotle, once confined to the groves of Athens, now found eager audiences in Roman forums and villas. The Stoics, in particular Zeno's school of discipline and endurance, resonated with Roman ideals. A philosophy that taught duty, self-control, and acceptance of fate suited the Roman temperament. Statesmen such as Cicero and Seneca found in Greek philosophy the tools to articulate their vision of life, governance, and morality. Yet perhaps the most profound legacy of Rome's conquest of Greece lay not in what Rome took from Greece, but in what it created from the Union. Out of war and plunder, Rome fashioned a cultural synthesis that would outlive both conqueror and conquered. The Greco-Roman civilization that emerged was neither purely Greek nor purely Roman, but a new creation greater than the sum of its parts. It was a civilization that would endure for centuries, shaping the Mediterranean world and, eventually, much of the globe. When later generations spoke of the foundations of the West, it was this synthesis they invoked. The Roman Empire, with its laws, roads, and legions, provided order and stability. Greek culture, with its art, philosophy, and literature, gave it soul. Together, They laid the groundwork for what would become Western civilization, an inheritance that stretched from the fall of the Republic to the rise of the Renaissance, from the philosophy of Marcus Aurelius to the scholarship of Thomas Aquinas. It is tempting to imagine Greece's conquest as an ending, a story of loss and ruin. The flames of Corinth, the silence of Pydna, the despair of cities forced into submission, these were real, and they were tragic. But in another sense, the conquest was a beginning. The Greeks, stripped of their independence, became immortal in another way. Their culture found a new home in the empire of their conquerors. Rome, for all its power, could not resist what Greece had to offer. And in embracing it, Rome ensured that the legacy of Greece would never fade. By the time Augustus stood at the dawn of the empire, Greece was no longer a defeated province. It was an inseparable part of Rome's identity. The emperor himself, though master of a Latin empire, paid homage to Greek traditions, styling himself in the image of Alexander as much as Aeneas. Rome had conquered Greece, but Greece had given Rome the vision of what an empire could mean, not merely power over others, but the stewardship of a cultural inheritance that stretched back to the dawn of philosophy. The story of how Rome conquered Greece, then, is not simply the story of armies and battles, of phalanxes broken by legions, or cities razed in war. It is the story of a paradox that a nation could be militarily destroyed and yet spiritually victorious. Greece lost its freedom, but it captured the imagination of its conquerors. Rome's triumph was total, yet incomplete, for in the very moment of conquest, Rome itself was changed forever. And in that paradox lies the enduring legacy. The world that emerged from the ashes of Greece's independence was one in which the ideals of Athens and the might of Rome coexisted, intertwined and inseparable. A world where the conqueror carried forward the dreams of the conquered. A world that, centuries later, would still look back to Greece and Rome as its foundations. The phalanx may have fallen, but the ideas of Greece marched on, sheltered beneath the eagle of Rome. Art and architecture followed. The plain, functional buildings of the early republic gave way to temples, theaters, and public spaces modeled on Hellenistic grandeur. Greek sculptors were commissioned to create works for Roman patrons, their statues of gods and heroes lining the streets of the capital. What had once been looted from Corinth and Athens now became a standard of taste. The Roman villa, adorned with mosaics and Greek-inspired frescoes, became a symbol of status. Even the triumphal arches of Roman emperors bore the imprint of Greek aesthetics. Literature, too, was transformed. Early Roman poetry had been simple, rustic, bound to the rhythms of Latin tradition. But with the coming of Greece, a new era began. Virgil, Horace, and Ovid drew inspiration from Homer and Hesiod, weaving Greek epic traditions into Roman identity. Virgil's Aeneid stood as a deliberate answer to Homer's Iliad, linking Rome's destiny to the fall of Troy, blending Greek myth with Roman ambition. In doing so, he gave Rome not only an epic equal to Greece, but a sense of continuity, a cultural inheritance legitimized by poetry. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this transformation was how the conquerors themselves acknowledged it. In the words of the poet Horace, Graecia capta ferum victorum cepit. Captive Greece took her savage conqueror captive. Rome had crushed Greece on the battlefield, yet found itself enthralled by Greek thought and art. The phrase captured a paradox. Greece had lost its freedom, but gained immortality through its power to shape the very civilization that had subdued it. In politics, too, Greece exerted a profound influence. Roman senators studied Greek rhetoric, learning the arts of persuasion and debate from the legacy of Demosthenes and Isocrates. Courts of law echoed with arguments steeped in Greek logic. Even the Roman conception of history, ordered, moralizing, and purposeful, was shaped by the works of Greek historians like Herodotus, Thucydides, and Polybius. Indeed, Polybius himself, once a hostage in Rome, became one of its greatest chroniclers, explaining the rise of Rome to a world that struggled to comprehend it. Religion, once rooted in the practical rituals of Roman ancestors, expanded under Greek influence. The Olympian gods, already akin to Rome's own deities, merged and mingled. Jupiter stood as Zeus, Venus as Aphrodite, Mars as Ares. New cults, inspired by Hellenistic mystery religions, entered the city. What had once been purely Roman was now a hybrid Greek in spirit, Roman in practice. Even military triumphs were reframed in Greek terms. Generals paraded not just spoils of war, but philosophers, artists, and teachers taken as prisoners. These men, in turn, educated the conqueror's children, sowing the seeds of admiration that would blossom into cultural dependence. The irony was not lost on contemporaries. Greece, though enslaved, had found a way to conquer the very minds of its masters. Over the course of a century, the transformation was so complete that Rome itself began to redefine its identity. No longer merely Latin, it became Greco-Roman. To be educated, to be civilized, was to know Greek. To aspire to greatness was to imitate Athens as much as to serve the Senate. Rome had forged a vast empire through war, but the soul of that empire was increasingly shaped by the inheritance of Greece. By the time Augustus formally established Greece as the Roman province of Achaia in 27 BCE, the union of conqueror and conquered was nearly inseparable. Greece no longer stood apart. It was woven into the very fabric of Roman life. The streets of Athens echoed with Roman soldiers, but also with Roman students. The ruins of Corinth stood as a warning, but its culture lived on in Roman palaces. The paradox of Greece's fate became clear. In losing its independence, it had gained eternal influence. Rome might claim political supremacy, but Greece would forever provide its cultural compass. Together, they forged a new civilization, one that future generations would look back upon as the foundation of the Western world. The Roman Empire was never purely Roman. It was Greco-Roman, a synthesis of strength and intellect, of conquest and creativity. And so, the conquest of Greece did not end with the sack of cities or the breaking of armies. It ended with the transformation of Rome itself. The legions had carried away statues and scrolls, but in the end, they had carried away something far greater, the essence of a civilization that refused to die. Greece had fallen, but in its fall, it had found a new way to endure through the very empire that had destroyed it. By the final decades of the 1st century BCE, the story of Rome's conquest of Greece had come full circle. What began as a clash of arms at Heraclea, Cynoscephalae, and Pydna ended not only in the subjugation of the Greek city-states, but in their transformation into pillars of Roman identity. With Augustus' rise to power in 27 BCE and the creation of the province of Achaia, the last vestiges of political independence vanished. Yet in truth, by then, Greece was not merely conquered. It had become part of Rome itself, woven into its culture, its politics, and even its vision of empire. This legacy was not simply the outcome of battles or treaties. It was the product of an extraordinary synthesis. Rome, with its unparalleled discipline and military strength, had inherited the intellectual and artistic traditions of Greece, traditions that had been forged in the golden age of Athens and carried forward through the Hellenistic kingdoms. The Roman Empire was no longer simply Roman, it was Greco-Roman. And it was this fusion, more than any single victory or defeat, that ensured the endurance of both civilizations. In Rome's public spaces, this transformation was plain to see. The city itself became a showcase of Hellenic art and architecture. Temples echoed with the symmetry of Greek design. Marble columns imported from quarries that had once supplied Athens now rose along the forum, and statues of philosophers, gods, and heroes adorned civic buildings. The stern pragmatism of early Roman construction gave way to a grandeur steeped in Greek ideals of harmony and proportion. To walk through Rome in the time of Augustus was to walk through a city that bore the imprint of two cultures at once. The intellectual life of Rome, too, bore the unmistakable stamp of Greece. Latin authors shaped their works in dialogue with Greek predecessors. Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, drew deeply from Greek philosophy, translating its ideas into a Roman idiom and using them to argue for republican ideals even as the republic itself collapsed. Virgil, Horace, and Ovid did not merely imitate Homer and Hesiod. They reframed Greek epic and lyric traditions to tell Rome's story, binding its destiny to the myths of Troy and the gods of Olympus. Through them, Greek literature was reborn in Latin, and Latin literature became inseparable from its Greek roots. Even in the private lives of Rome's elite, Greece held sway. Education itself was Greek. Young Roman nobles were taught first their letters, then their rhetoric, by Greek tutors. To be considered truly cultured was to be able to quote from Homer, to debate Aristotle, to grasp the subtleties of Plato. Greek became the language of philosophy and high culture, while Latin remained the language of law and empire. A Roman senator might deliberate in Latin by day, but in the evening he would read Greek verse by lamplight, or listen as a philosopher discoursed on the nature of virtue. The influence stretched further still into realms of religion and identity. The Roman gods had long borne a resemblance to their Greek counterparts, but under the empire, the lines blurred almost entirely. Jupiter was Zeus, Venus was Aphrodite, and Mars was Ares. Roman festivals adopted Hellenic rites, while new cults of mystery and salvation, born in the Greek world, spread into Italy and beyond. In philosophy, Stoicism, an import from Greece, became the moral backbone of Roman statesmanship, its emphasis on duty, reason, and endurance harmonizing perfectly with Rome's vision of itself.